Elhanany. I work in the Machine Intelligence Lab at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and our paper is titled On the Broad Implications of a Reinforcement Learning-Based AGI. So, on the broad implications of reinforcement learning-based AGI, in our paper, first we think that, or we argue that, whereas a lot of presentations at this conference have looked at various aspects of what an AGI system might have, there have been a few complete architectures, but generally the focus has been on specific aspects of AGI and how they might fit into a bigger AGI system. We argue, and this isn't a technical presentation, we argue that reinforcement learning is the overall framework that an artificial general intelligence can be embodied in. And so first we look at what's missing in current reinforcement learning theory, and then assuming that an RL-based AGI is created, we look at some of the ethical implications of such a system. So first, quick review, for those of you who might not be familiar with it. Reinforcement learning generally involves two components. There's the agent, or in here it's called the AGI agent, the RL-based AGI agent, that interacts with its environment. Constantly, the environment is providing observations to the agent. These are incomplete. This could be just considered the raw sensor data provided to a system, and the agent attempts to infer its state from this raw data. So right now in this room, you're able to infer your state of being in this room or in this building on this campus. It's a fairly contextual, complicated state inference system. So reinforcement learning, there's a state inference and there's a reward provided by the environment, non-specific reward provided constantly. It's feedback. And what the agent attempts to do is select actions so as to maximize this reward over the long term. It develops something called a value function. So in a particular state, it takes a particular action to maximize the long-term reward, and if it can do so with a particular action, that is considered to be a valuable action, even if the immediate reward given from the environment is not very large. So what's missing in current reinforcement learning theory? One of the biggest points is state representation. Many RL systems have looked at toy problems, and even some of them scale reasonably well, but they can't handle high-dimensional problems, nor they don't handle very well different spatial and temporal dimensions. As a human, you can handle, or you can understand your state in a particular context in your life across a decade, just as well as you're able to handle your state within this weekend. And so an RL system that can scale very well is going to need to be able to handle high-dimensional states across multiple spatial and temporal dimensions. The reward function. Traditionally, RL systems have a fairly simple reward function. It's ultimately reduced to a scalar value. Whatever maximizes this scalar reward is what's desirable. But in biological systems, or even in humans, it seems that reward isn't so simply defined. There isn't simply some maximum amount of some neurotransmitter that we're trying to get. It's a more complicated process, and we think if this could be improved in RL theory, there's some hope for an RL-based AGI. Next is action selection. This largely follows from state representation. If we can handle or improve RL theory to have highly dimensional states across multiple spatial, temporal scales, then action selection and action representation should follow from that. And finally, the value function. Traditional RL methods use something called a time decaying constant. So as I look forward into the future, further and further, this constant causes the weight of a reward in the distant future to be given, or to be near zero. Now, in a human, you operate on multiple timescales of reward. So in this conference, you're seeking positive feedback from the audience in your presentation, so that's a fairly short-term reward. At the same time, for me personally, I'm working on going through graduate school, so that's a further different time scale than what I'm dealing with right now, and yet as a high-level intelligence system, I'm able to handle that fairly cleanly, quickly, and current RL theory just doesn't have good methods for doing that. And so we talk about this more in our paper, just to save time, I won't go too much into this. So assuming that we have an RL-based AGI, what are some control methods? A straightforward one, fairly obvious, is just limiting the hardware resources. So even if we can develop a very complex state representation that could support general intelligence, if the hardware simply isn't there, there are limits on the memory, then a very complicated understanding of the state can't be achieved. So a method to control an application is simply the hardware on which this RL-based AGI runs. More interesting, and another area to focus research in reinforcement learning, is understanding how reward definitions affect the long-term behavior. So an immediate reward might be some kind of positive feedback from humans for this RL-based AGI. If we can understand how that basic reward will affect the behavior of the long term, will the AGI try to build playpens for humans? it will just take careful analysis to understand that. But that's also a point of control, is the reward function definition, sometimes called utility function in economics. Reasons for limiting the capabilities are fairly obvious. Application, if there's a dog in Second Life that has certain reasons for limitations as opposed to an AGI that's managing flight scheduling. So, and more interestingly, now we look at the ethical implications of an RL-based AGI. We hypothesize the existence of an intelligence threshold. Let me give an example. A dog, some of you might have pet dogs or cats. Your dog seems to be fairly happy. And it's actually a very intelligent organism, but it seems to be aware of you as its owner, but it isn't aware of what you're doing, in a sense. It's not aware of you participating in this conference and in high-level thinking. It doesn't mourn that. That is, it can't mourn its inability to write poetry. But for those of you who have children, at a certain age, the child is able to realize what it lacks, the intelligence that it's going to gain one day by hard work and also by some more physical development. But the child is aware of what it can achieve over time. And so we consider this child, or this level of intelligence, as past the intelligence threshold. The intelligence threshold is important because we consider it an ethical tipping point for AGI, or RL-based AGI. Once the AGI has progressed past a certain level of intelligence, we argue that arbitrary limitation of further expansion of the intelligence is unethical. By arbitrary, I mean if there's an AGI on this computer right now running, and it is trying to communicate or interact with the internet in order to gain more knowledge, and if it's past this intelligence threshold, we argue that limiting that is unethical. Arbitrarily limiting it. If I were just to walk away and the AGI would do that, then that is it expanding its intelligence on its own. And so some of the implications of that, we think that in an RL-based system, an agent would develop, or an AGI would develop a hierarchy of needs, analogous to a human's hierarchy of needs. Maslow, a psychologist, would put that forward. Higher callings that humans have, self-actualization. We argue that an RL-based AGI would develop such higher callings. Again, at a high level of intelligence, it will be going for those goals, and arbitrary restriction, we argue, might be unethical. 3 minutes, okay. So, I guess moving on. And one of the key points to this, it may sound kind of strange at first, is something that Kant put forward, that no man should be viewed as merely a means. Each man will be an end in himself. And we argue past this intelligence threshold, perhaps we should no longer consider AGI as merely a tool, but a collaborator, something that we will work with and give it mutual respect as we would have it give us respect. And so in the paper we go into more detail, but perhaps these RL-based AGI systems should be given entrance into human moral communities, such as citizenship, certain rights and responsibilities. If the AGI violates this, then we could give it some kind of penalization depending on its underlying reward function. And so those are some of the points we put forward. And finally, this is a little bit of a side issue. Many acknowledge that eventually human-level intelligence would be surpassed by a system, an AGI system, that continues to improve itself, particularly in a reinforcement learning setting. In order to maximize reward optimally, there's a very strong drive to improve intelligence. We posit that there will be extra-human moral theories that develop. Those will be moral theories that we cannot understand because they are beyond our intelligence. And so we suggest the creation of a trust system. As long as the AGI operates within certain bounds, then we would allow it to go about its actions, engage in private contracts, perhaps, again, going back to the citizenship, and other things, and we'd allow it to use its own reasoning so long as it doesn't violate this trust that we have. Sorry. Okay, and so closing thoughts, conclusion. There are several limitations existing in current reinforcement learning theory, but we do argue and put forward that reinforcement learning is the general framework in which AGI will be framed as a system that makes sense, even in economic terms, just as a utility function to maximize it seems to be reasonable. And assuming that we are able to achieve those improvements in reinforcement learning that I mentioned, there are some different methods for controlling it, obvious ones, Harbor, and so on. But one of the most important points in our paper that we're trying to argue in the discussion, you can try to challenge it and I'll try to defend it, as the existence of this intelligence threshold, which is the ethical tipping point for the AGI, the point at which it deserves respect as an end in itself, not just a tool for human ends. And I guess that summarizes the main point. With regard to all of this, we think now is the time to consider the implications of a reinforcement learning-based system so that we are ready for, once it's developed, how we might enter it or give it citizenship or give it other particular rights and responsibilities therein. So thank you.